your notebook. There's more.
Welcome to CN Live, Season 6, Episode 12, BRICS Rising. I'm Joe Loria, the Editor-in-Chief of Consortium News. Each year, it seems that the BRICS Summit is the most important one ever held, as a new order is being built in the world. The first BRIC Summit was held in Russia in 2009, consisting of Russia, China, Brazil, and India. South Africa was later added to make it BRICS. There are now 9 BRICS Plus members, and this year's BRICS Summit is in Kazan, Russia, starting on Tuesday. On the agenda are the creation of economic mechanisms to develop a new economic, financial, and commercial system that will exist independent of the declining West. Also, on the agenda will be the crisis in the Middle East, in particular involving new BRICS member Iran. Here to discuss all this and more is journalist Pepe Escobar, who is in Moscow, and former UN weapons inspector and journalist Scott Ritter in New York State. We will also be joined by geostrategic analyst Mark Slebod, who's also coming to us from Moscow. We're joined by Pepe Escobar. Pepe is a longtime correspondent for Asia Times and now for The Cradle, and he will be attending this week's BRICS Summit. So we're very happy to have Pepe here with us, and in upstate New York is Scott Ritter. Pepe, let me start with you. Can you just tell me quickly, what do you think the top 3 stories will be at the summit beginning in Kazan this week?
Wow. I've been following this since for 1 year, virtually nonstop. I spent over 5 months in Russia this year, including 2 very important meetings at the end of the year and earlier this year with Sergei Ryabkov, Russian Deputy Prime Minister, the #1 Russian Sherpa for BRICS, and with Foreign Minister Lavrov. He received like 7 or 8 of us earlier this year for 1 hour and a half, which in the case of Lavrov is something unbelievable. His agenda, he needs 70 hours a day for his agenda. And they were very enthusiastic on several points. One, that they know that this is a historic opportunity for Russia, Russian presidency of BRICS, and in the year that BRICS now is the talk of the town in any town, everywhere, in every latitude. At the same time, they are very realistic. Lavrov explicitly said, and they haven't changed their position, we're not going to expand BRICS this year. First, we need to accommodate the new members, which, by the way, at the moment are 9.5. They are not 10, because Saudi Arabia, of course, is over the wall. And according to Peskov, 2 or 3 days ago, he said that, yes, the status of Saudi Arabia will be defined in Kazan next week. And accommodate the new members. Of course, the list of everybody who wants to apply, join, etc. Now it's reaching 40 nations and counting, of course. They had at least 200 meetings, BRICS related, in Russia this year, which is something enormous. I went to a few of them, and this past week, since last Friday, the 3 most important ones, because these are the final meetings which answers your question in a way already. The first one was Friday, 1 week ago, the meeting of the BRICS finance ministers and heads of central banks. Very, very important. You can read their final declaration online at the BRICS site. It is vague. It has to be, because there are still internal contradictions, especially India, China. Goes without saying, right? At the same time, there is we can say it's a list of intentions of what they plan to do, not only in Kazan, but further on down the road. The next year is the Brazilian presidency of BRICS. So the Russians will instruct the Brazilians, this is the most important things, to concentrate on. And this week we had the final meeting of the working groups. There are working groups on literally everything. The most important ones are, of course, alternative payment systems, BRICS Pay, which is their way of evading SWIFT, and de-dollarization. And the final meeting of the BRICS Business Council, which is the bridge between the Sherpas, everything that they discuss politically, economically, and businesses, not only Russian, but Chinese, other BRICS as well. And at the end, of course, at the plenary session, we had Putin speaking, and then what Putin said in his meeting with the heads of different media agencies from different, all over BRICS. And of course, this monopolizes the headline, still monopolizing the headlines, because there are some hints and some nuggets in what he said that we imagine that next week in Kazan, there will be some really straight up announcements on BRICS Pay, which is, they even presented, it was very funny, they presented the BRICS Pay card on Thursday. So with a demo, with 500 rubles inside, which is a little over $5, where you can scan the code, you go to a terminal, you scan the code in a terminal, like Alipay in China, for instance, and that's it. And so this is a trial run. And
this is for consumers. This is for consumers,
yes,
Pepe.
exactly.
Only in the BRICS countries. Yeah.
Exactly, because this is for consumers already. It's fascinating. Yeah. No wonder countries from all over the world are interested. It will become some sort of global Alipay, like, in Asia, in Southeast Asia, where I live. You go to Thailand now, you can pay anything with Alipay now, even in street vendors. So BRICS Pay is something similar. And then the more serious issues, which are cross-border payment settlements, which is already going on. For instance, Russia-China trade balance, I think around 90%, the latest numbers, it's already bypassing the dollar. It's in rubles and in yuan. So this is expanding all over the BRICS as well, including little by little, of course, much more complicated BRICS that are very close with the international financial system. And then it gets way more complicated. And that's where the key discussion, which is we need alternative payment systems, totally bypassing the international financial system, which is something that you don't see in this final declaration last week of the ministers of finance and the heads of central bank. They basically say that you need to improve the international financial system, but they don't go against it. Of course, they can't for the moment. It's too risky, it's too dangerous. And Putin said that yesterday. We're proceeding little by little. And of course, the holy grail is de-dollarization, but this is a long shot. Putin once again told everybody, look, we're working towards it. It's a long shot. But first, we need to not only have a consensus inside BRICS, and that's an enormous problem inside BRICS. Sometimes you have to have a consensus of, let's say, 5 or 6 among 9.5. If you expect for the 9.5 to have a consensus on these tricky issues, it's going to be too slow. And this is what the Russians are trying to convince the other partners. Look, we had to accelerate. We already did a lot this year, but the whole global South is watching us, and they want practical measures like yesterday. And this is what may provide us, hopefully.
Every BRICS summit is the most important one they've ever had. This one seems
no, but this one is this is different, Joe. I've been to a lot before. Right. This is a completely different story.
You're talking about the nuts and bolts of creating a whole new financial and commercial system in the world. Now, was this already going on before the sanctions related to the Ukraine crisis?
It was
accelerated. It's only been accelerated by Ukraine.
Exactly. It was, Joe. Of course, they started discussing, to give you an idea, they started discussing this during the second Lula presidency in the late 2000s. So this is a long time ago, long time ago. At the time, Lula was very, very keen on bypassing the dollar, which, by the way, was one of the reasons of the American campaign against him and then Dilma that led to the coup against Dilma and to throw Lula in jail. This was key, absolutely key in the whole thing. He actually told Obama that. And that was, considering that Lula is a good strategist, that was a major mistake.
Right.
So, of course, after the SMO, and when the Russians were expelled from SWIFT, of course, and the Russians were already in 2022, the Russians were already thinking about 2024 this year because they knew they will be the presidency of BRICS, and they'll have a super shot to accelerate the whole thing. And that's exactly what happened. But the most interesting discussions, Joe, Scott, is when we talk to some of the Sherpas and some of the guys in the financial sphere who are aware of the discussions. For instance, try to convince the Chinese about the big picture, because Chinese banks, they're absolutely terrified of American secondary sanctions. So you need to organize bypassing the dollar system that is absolutely foolproof. And so this is what they're trying, but it's medium term, right? It's, for instance, with these little things like a card that, anybody around the world can understand what it means. And it starts with the BRICS, and certainly BRICS partners, or what they call BRICS Plus or BRICS Outreach, they will want that the same way. Which is something that, and then the system itself, the Russian Ministry of Finance calls it BRICS Pay. I do hope that they explain what is BRICS Pay next week, because nobody knows what it means. BRICS Bridge, sorry. BRICS Pay is the card. BRICS Bridge is the mechanism. And it's based on the M Bridge, which is a system that involves the Bank of International Settlements, the European Central Bank, and the IMF. So it's the enemy. You need a different thing. But it's, let's say, it's an inspiration for all the BRICS finance wizards in different countries. Okay, let's come up with our version of M-Bridge. For instance, a very simple example. On M-Bridge, the Thais sell oil, buy oil from the Emirates, I'm sorry, and they don't pay with Thai baht. They pay with this M-Bridge unit. So the BRICS Bridge will be something similar. So we hope, all of us, we hope that they will announce something more definitive about it next week. But
that is replacing the dollar ultimately. That is the de-dollarization then. Instead of paying for oil, dollars.
This is one of the nodes of de-dollarization. De-dollarization is an incredibly complex phenomenon because you have to start from scratch. And our friend Michael Hudson has been writing about this and talking about this for years.
And this is also like a proto BRICS currency, which is way off. Putin said on yesterday, rather. This is the proto. Let me move on from the economics, which is extremely important because this is for a lot of people who are more interested in politics, the more boring part of it, but absolutely necessary to create an emerging new world, displacing the West. And I want to ask you what the Americans think about all this too. But let's talk about politics for a minute. It's a particularly crucial time in the Middle East, obviously. You mentioned, I saw you with the judge, that there's going to be a special Palestinian session. And of course, there's the Iran-Russian relationship and the strategic partnership. Say a few words about the role that the Middle East will play in the summit next week.
Well, we are, Joe, we are all expecting this special session on Palestine. It's not 100% confirmed. It's practically confirmed that they will have a special session dedicated to Palestine, not only with the BRICS, but with the BRICS outreach, the BRICS Plus. This means, for instance, Erdogan will be in the session because Turkey is applying to be a member of BRICS. And that's another fascinating story. I was in Istanbul a few days ago, and I was asking everybody about it. And it's a Netflix series in itself. Erdogan, what Erdogan really sees in BRICS, Well, we can say that the position on Palestine among, I would say, virtually all the current 9.5 members coincides. There are some who are much more vocal, like Iran and Russia, and other ones like the Chinese. The Chinese, what they have been saying via the foreign minister these past few days is it's not typical Chinese politesse anymore. You know, they're much more forceful than they were months ago, for instance. So the global South expects a BRICS declaration, a consensual BRICS declaration on Palestine. We all hope this is going to happen. It's going to be very difficult, but I think it would be an enormous plus for BRICS taking a position, a definitive position on Palestine. From the point of view of Russia, we know it's very complicated. Russians with double passports, all the Russians who live in Israel, the Russians linked to the oligarchs linked to the international financial system, you know, the back and forth of a lot of money. So, but they're trying hard because their patience is already, and this we can see the way Ryabkov and Lavrov are, even their body language when they talk about Israel in Gaza and now in Lebanon. It changed.
BRICS will name it as a genocide. Will they condemn Israel, do you think, in a joint communique?
They will never use the word genocide, Joe, but they will use something that will be understood by the global majority as condemning a genocide. This is what everyone expects here.
Now,
and Putin yesterday, he said something very, very interesting, which is, I would say this is the crux of the Russian position. They have excellent dialogue with Iran for obvious reasons. They're going to sign a comprehensive strategic partnership after the BRICS summit. Pezeshkian is going to come here and they're going to sign this partnership together. But also they talk to Israel all the time. So I wonder what they listen from the Israeli side. Of course, this you don't see leaks about this here anywhere. But including, of course, those backroom dealers, which are Russian oligarchs working in the international financial system. These are conduits. These are back and forth guys as well. But, you remember a few days ago, I'm sure you all remember a few days ago when Israel bombed a warehouse that they said was Iranian weapons for Hezbollah near the Haimim air base in Syria. The way this was taken here was wow. It was, they said, aha, so now they're about to attack us in Syria as well. And there is, as Scott knows very well, there is an unwritten agreement between Israel and Russia. They don't attack each other in Syria. But this came very, very close. So the whole situation is very fluid, very complicated. The way Putin put it yesterday was in a sense that, look, we are sort of mediators between Israel and Iran. They could be, assuming that the eschatological cult in Tel Aviv listens to anybody, and they don't. That's the problem.
Now, the strategic partnership between Russia and Iran, it won't be like an Article 5 situation where if Iran is attacked.
No,
nothing like that.
Not so drastic. Yes.
What exactly what will Russia be obligated to do for Iran? Just as a weapons deal, essentially, then?
Exactly. We have to wait for the final text, Joe, because they are fine-tuning this text for months. And the deal itself, it's over 2 years that they are discussing it. So it's an enormously complex thing. What is already happening is military interaction. No question about that. And this is something that we heard last year here already. One of those Iranian delegations coming, there are Iranian delegations coming here all the time. One of them, they told us, look, we told the Russians, look, anything you want, military terms, just ask. And the Russian reply is likewise. So this is what's been happening for over a year now. Everybody knows that, including the S-400s now in Iran. Very, very important. So there will be developments about that. But we still need to read the fine print of the final text, which is going to be after BRICS only. But they're getting closer and closer on so many levels. And the geoeconomic level is very, very important as well. It's the International North-South Transportation Corridor, which it's a sort of, you can interpret it as a sort of New Silk Road 2.0, but without China. This one is Russia, Iran, and India. And the Indians, of course, very, very important thing for all of you, our audience. Do you know who was the #1 supporter inside BRICS to bring Iran into BRICS? It was not China, it was India, because they were looking at the geoeconomics of the whole thing and said, wow, this corridor for us is perfect because we can export not only to Iran and then to Central Asia, to the Caucasus as well, but also to Russia and to the Russian sphere as well. So the Indians are very much keen on the North-South transportation corridor. And Putin mentioned yesterday, he mentioned 2 key corridors of the future. And it's very, very telling that he mentioned the North-South, Russia, Iran, India, and the Arctic Silk Road. The Chinese call it the Arctic Silk Road. The Russians call it the Northern Route. It's absolutely the same thing. And of course, this is linked with the development of Siberia and the Russian Far East as well. So it's so interconnected. And with these 4 BRICS in sync geoeconomic, India, China, Russia, and Iran, now this is going to go much faster than up to now.
Very good. Now, Scott, thank you for your patience. I want to go quickly through Pepe because he has to leave, and then we'll bring you in. You did write.
Can I listen to Scott a little bit at least?
Not yet, not yet. But Scott did write about how the India, Middle East, European so-called Silk Road that would have involved Israel is kind of dead after all of this. But that's something Scott may want to bring up as well. Quickly, Pepe, what happened to Chinese diplomacy in the Middle East? They brought Iran and Saudi Arabia together in accommodation that people for years were hoping for that would solve so many of the conflicts in the Middle East. Is that still alive? And is Saudi Arabia denying Israel overflight rights if they want to attack Iran?
Not only Saudi Arabia, the whole GCC. In fact, the whole GCC went to the Americans and said, please tell the Israelis, don't do this, because we're going to pay the price. On Chinese diplomacy, very important point. I'm sure you all remember the Beijing Declaration, when 14 factions in Palestine, including Hamas, represented by Ismail Haniyeh, went to Beijing. They sat on the same room. Wang Yi, Chinese foreign minister, presiding over everything, with the Chinese imprimatur on the whole. It's extremely serious from a Chinese point of view, vouching for all this, which was, okay, all these factions will come together for unity in Palestine, and China, once again, is in favor of an independent, sovereign Palestine. This was signed with the Chinese, carefully observing everything. What happens a few days later? Ismail Haniyeh is assassinated. You have no idea, guys, how this was taken in Beijing. It was taken as a direct affront against China, a slap on the face, a loss of face for the Chinese, and something in diplomatic terms that it's beyond reproachable. So this reflects on what the Chinese foreign ministry, every day that passes, is getting more forceful when they talk about Palestine and condemning Israel. So there will be long-term repercussions. Don't forget that the Chinese never do anything rash. Everything is carefully calculated, very subtle, and then when you see it, it's already happening.
Okay, last question in this rapid round here, and we're going to go to Scott. Then I have one more for you before you leave. How does the U.S.-led West, how are they viewing BRICS in general in this particular summit? You look at the press there, they don't seem to get it. I'm sure there are people in the State Department, maybe some smart people somewhere in the U.S., maybe in the Pentagon, who understand this world is changing and rapidly. U.S. is not in the same place it was. This is an alignment of countries which has a greater GDP now than the G7, and that they are openly opposing U.S. unilateralism in the world, empire, essentially. and that they got to deal with this. They have to come to terms with it. Do you see that happening, or do they still are clueless, the West in general, about what's happened, how the world's changing, as represented by BRICS, and particularly this summit, how important it is?
Joe, you nailed it. They don't get it. And they didn't get it when BRICS was formed. They didn't get it over these past 15 years. They still don't get it now, but they are afraid, they are scared to death, because now they see a serious counterpower forming, and it's not only BRICS. BRICS is on the forefront, but it's a matrix of new multilateral organizations. Includes BRICS, the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, the Eurasia Economic Union, the ASEAN, the 10 of Southeast Asia, projects of the Chinese New Silk Road, connectivity corridors all over, across Eurasia, everywhere. So when they look at that, and the fact that this is around Latin America, around Africa, everybody's terribly excited about it, and this enormous list of nations joining BRICS, they are scared. And there is, I would say, among the sharpest minds between here, China, and India, there is more or less a consensus that everything that the US is doing now is a war against BRICS as well. And this, from my point of view of living in this Europe, Asia, Eurasia corridor for the past decades, in fact, I completely agree with this interpretation. Ukraine essentially is a proxy war, we all know, against US, NATO, against Russia, but also against Europe and against China. Against China in terms of preventing some of the Chinese corridors of the New Silk Road, the ones going to Russia, or the ones also using Russia, or southern Russia as well. West Asia is the same thing. Don't forget that very important West Asian nations now are BRICS members. So it's not by accident that we have this total dementia: Israel, Gaza, Palestine, Lebanon, and these wet dreams of going beyond the Nile to Euphrates dementia. This is not by accident, because they see a window of opportunity. If we don't do it now, you won't have any opportunity to do it later. And even if they're trying to do it now, they are at the same time sacrificing their version of the New Silk Roads, which is that absolutely stupid IMEC corridor. Which essentially, they cannot put it on the acronym, right? The IMEC corridor is Israel, Saudi Arabia, Emirates, and Europe on one side, and India on the other. For the moment, this thing is dead, and will probably remain dead. Because everything that is happening between Gaza and Lebanon. But
that's fascinating.
The war against BRICS, I would say the overarching picture is the war, an US-Israeli war against BRICS. And it's not by accident, and Scott knows better than anybody, that these three BRICS are considered the three top existential threats to the US: Russia, China, and Iran.
That is fascinating, Pepe. The idea that the resurrection of this attempt to recreate an ancient Hebrew empire and to expand all the way is not just because of this extreme right-wing government that saw the October 7 as the opportunity to put in plans that go back to Ben-Gurion in his diary. This is what Greater Israel, this is what they have been in slow motion and slow ethnic cleansing been doing over the last 70 years, that it's been sped up not only because of this government and October 7, but because they see the power of BRICS growing. This is their chance now. I find that really fascinating. I haven't heard that before.
Absolutely. Yes.
That is fantastic. We're going to go to Scott, but I just want to say that they can thank Goldman Sachs for this. The West doesn't understand it, but they're the ones who started the idea of BRICS, didn't they? 2001.
Jim O'Neill from Goldman Sachs came up with the original BRIC.
What he unleashed. Scott, sorry, thank you for... Now you get to hear Scott. Okay, Scott, you got the floor.
Oh, no, I could listen to Pepe all day. So, I mean,
me too, but he has to run. So,
but we got to rest his voice as a conference. Look, all I can say is that I concur with everything that Pepe said. Also note though, I mean, Pepe touched upon it, when we talked about Palestine. Um, it's not just the economic potential of BRICS. The West is struggling. The interesting thing is at least the West sort of acknowledges that that BRICS could be an economic problem for the the dollar dominated system. Um, but what nobody's really touching on is the geopolitical challenges that BRICS is going to place on the rules-based international order. Um, and not just the International Monetary Fund, the World Bank, but basically the system that gives America what that gave America the ability to be a global hegemon since the end of the Second World War. That system is over, and it's by design. I mean, it's not an accident. Um, when we look at the acceleration of BRICS that we talked about, starting with uh, the special military operation in 2022, the special military operation began on February 24th. February 4th, 20 days prior, Putin meets Xi Jinping in Beijing in one of the most important meetings of the modern age. And the West has seemed to ignores this and forgets it. But that 5,000 plus word joint statement that they published was a declaration of war uh, by a multipolarity against the unitary hegemon. Literally, it said we are against this. This is wrong. We're moving in this direction. And BRICS and the Shanghai Cooperation Organization and the G20. I mean, the three things they listed in this joint statement was BRICS, SCO, and the G20 were the vehicles in which they were going to challenge this. Now, over that time, BRICS has become the dominant one. It's the one that has the most potential for effectively challenging it, not just economically, but geopolitical. Let's take a look at and Pepe. Correct me if I'm wrong, because you've got your finger on the pulse. I'm so jealous of you, by the way. I can't tell you how insanely
You should be
jealous
here, Scott. You should go to.
I was supposed to be where you are
Yeah.
with you, working with you to see this, to see history. This is, when the history books are written, if we can survive, what's happening right now in BRICS is going to go down as, I mean, this is a Bretton Woods type event. This is a global changing event. This is the birth of something new. And you are there, man. I am so envious of you. And I'm glad you're there, though, because you'll provide effective assessment of it. But I'm purple with envy because I wanted to be there with you. But that's okay. But so an interesting thing happened. South Africa just recently told Taiwan, get your fake embassy out of the capital and move it because you're not a nation. You're not, you don't get to pretend to be a nation. And they did this to please China. And what this tells me is that, we are focused on a lot of things, a lot of the effort to assuage India's ruffled feathers about being concerned about China, et cetera. But China has some ruffled feathers too, and the Taiwan issue is one of them. And what you're seeing is through BRICS, China is getting the rest of the world to align with China on the issue of Taiwan. And this is a very important phenomena because it's the world is abandoning the American approach towards the Taiwan problem. And I think what South Africa did is again reflective of the kind of the behind the scenes diplomacy that China is undertaking that the West is ignoring. We again, what you said about bringing 14 Palestinian factions together was a huge event, beyond imagination, and the consequences of assassinating Haniyeh. I'm glad you brought that up because when we talk about you know things that have an impact on resolving this, that's one of them. There is a whole world out there that's not called the United States um, that is looking at the Palestinian crisis and coming up with a solution. And they will come up with a solution because the United States can't come up with a solution. The United States is the problem, not the solution. And yet here in the West, we don't talk about this at all. So I think that was very important. And then the other thing is, well, again, on Palestine, in the West, we're singularly focused on Israel, Iran, United States helping Israel against Iran. But what we forget is the consequences of that happening, what will happen, not just in terms of the military consequences, but the global consequences. And I think the world is telling the United States, directly and indirectly, that this will be fatal to Israel, not in terms of an Iranian attack, not in terms of a Russian attack, but as you see, there's a hardening of position. Israel exists not just because of its relationship with the United States, but the fact that so many other nations have extended it a lifeline. So many other nations are willing to do business with Israel, despite Israel's horrific policies against the Palestinians. And what we're seeing now is at a time when Israel's economy is tanking, $67 billion hit last year, because of this war. And it's going to get worse this year, and it's not going to improve because nobody's investing. And do you think China is going to lead the charge to invest in Israel if this problem gets resolved? Not after what they did to Hanea. Do you think Russia is going to bend over backwards to keep this oligarch, corruption alive and well? Putin, I believe, is looking for any opportunity to continue snipping the links of the oligarchs, the connectivity they have with Russia. And this, so I think Israel is going to find themselves fatally isolated because of this. And and what I mean by fatally is that when this crisis is resolved, and hopefully it will be without a regional war, because a regional war could very well be fatal to Israel. What Iran is capable of doing to Israel, both conventionally and I believe with nuclear weapons, it's the end of Israel. Now, it means the end of a lot of things, but if for those people who say we're doing this because we want to support Israel, understand all you're doing is supporting the death of Israel. And Israel can die one of two ways, violently or starving to death. And I believe that Israel's fate is to starve to death, that the world is not going to be investing in the resurrection of a Zionist entity, that Israel will be left to its own devices, and those own devices will cause Israel to crumble from within. How do you resolve the West Bank settlement issue? Because you can't have a Palestinian state without resolving the West Bank issue. How does Israel tell the West Bank settlers that it's coddled for so many years that you have to leave? This will be a civil war, something the Israeli president has warned about. And Russia, China, India will not be there to save Israel. That's, I think, the important thing that's coming out. And if they can get this message captured at the BRICS summit and educate Israel and the United States about this reality, you might see a change of posture on the part of the Israelis. Because right now, Netanyahu is operating, from a strategic standpoint of what's in front of his nose. He's not doing the long-term thinking that Israel is normally famous for. And maybe it's time for people to re-educate them. And then lastly, Ukraine. I think BRICS is going to be very big about Ukraine. A key aspect of Ukraine is the hope that the international community has, or not the international community, that the United States and Europe has, that they will be able to somehow get the global South to come with them to isolate Russia. They continue to throw out sanctions. They continue to, maneuver to get the global South. And I think BRICS will put a nail in that coffin. I think at the end of BRICS, the United States and Europe will come face to face with the reality that they are isolated on the issue of Ukraine. And this will, I think, further their recognition that you need to bring this war to a conclusion. And I think that's going to be one of the big things. So the geopolitical consequences of BRICS, I think, is going to be every bit as powerful as the economic consequences.
Can I ask a question, Scott?
Of course.
Yeah, I'm sure you'll be the ideal person to respond to this. What would be this Wunderwaffen weapon that the IRGC says that they have more powerful than a nuclear bomb? Nobody can put their finger on it.
I've been trying to figure out. I saw an interesting article yesterday about lasers, and I'm going, no, that's not. No, I don't think that's it. Because they were talking about ships sinking. They're talking about, suddenly ships were sinking in a protected harbor. They sank. And I'm thinking that they have created some sort of additive to petroleum that will cause a deterioration of metal structures. That Iran is basically saying that we can destroy you using the oil that you need, that we can contaminate in a way that you can't detect it. That's my guess, is that their wonder weapon will shut down pipelines, shut down tank. I'm just reading into the statements made by them. When I listen to their statements, it sounded like the ships were sinking from something that was happening from within. And the only thing that could be from within is the oil that they were carrying. And so maybe Iran has perfected some sort of time delayed or something additive to it. That's all I'm thinking, because there's no other weapon out there that could have the impact of a nuclear weapon that's when you think of, okay, are they talking about fuel air explosives, lasers? There's nothing that comes close to the destruction power. But if you're able, using the indirect approach, to come up with something like that. But again, I don't know. These are mysterious statements made by the Iranians. But when I was reverse engineering the statements made about the things they've already done, they all impacted oil tankers, and they impacted oil tankers that were far removed from Iran's ability to directly impact. So it implies that whatever happened on the tankers was something that was put on the tankers, and they're sounding like it was happening from the cargo destroying the tanker, and the cargo's oil. So this is purely speculation on my part, but this is where I'm at. And I'm not a scientist, I'm not clever enough as a chemist to sit there and say how this could happen. But you know who is clever? The Iranians. There's some of those clever
The
people.
Iranians, yes, absolutely, yeah. And adding to something that you said, very, very important. The Chinese, for the first time, via the foreign ministry, are saying that NATO is essentially responsible for the war in Ukraine.
Yeah. Well, China's waking up to the danger of NATO, because NATO's trying to expand to the Pacific, and China's like, it's time that China has to call a spade a spade. As you said, the Chinese are very reticent about getting too far ahead, that before they take an action, they have to have all their ducks in order. But with NATO, I think they're recognizing that they do have to put a marker down, because they need to stop this irresponsible expansion of NATO. So the best way to do that is to confront NATO in Europe about the irresponsible nature of their behavior vis-a-vis Ukraine. And to have China weigh in on that, again, we one thing we don't talk about is when we speak of Belts and Roads Initiative and things like that, the Chinese influence on the European economy, and how absolutely a prisoner of China Europe has become. So China has plenty of ways to put pressure on Europe, directly and indirectly, to emphasize the point that expansion of NATO could be very bad for the health of Europe going forward. And so this is part of China's mysterious ways to put a marker on the table like that, and then I believe their diplomacy will catch up.
Joe,
Pepe, do you have to run, or you can stay a little bit longer?
Yeah, okay, let's stay. Well, the conversation is wonderful. Let's stay a little bit more.
Okay, so you agree with what Scott said about Ukraine being part of the a communique that comes out of here and having a big impact? That the U.S. will notice this.
I don't think BRICS is going to directly address the Ukrainian tragedy. No, don't forget, this is, first of all, geopolitical, geoeconomic, overarching, consensus building meeting. So, and of course, the major announcements won't be specific to these, let's say, these chapters of the American Forever Wars, Ukraine or in West Asia. But very, very important, the fact that the Chinese, they never explicitly condemned Russia for the SMO. This is very, very important. India never explicitly condemned Russia for the SMO. This will be reflected in what they will discuss. No question about that. Something very important that I was making a note while Scott was talking. The way these deliberations inside BRICS work, and we're learning all the time from some of the Sherpas, they leak things here, there is finally the top geoeconomic issues, they are more or less agreeing. These geopolitical tragedies, in fact. They think that they don't need specifically to address it as a consensus in front of a global audience. So that's a difference between the geoeconomic track and the geopolitical track. They want to attract the global south. So they cannot be too contrarian to the Western dominated system. Putin said something very interesting. We are not against the West. We are a different club. It's completely different. And the appeal of this club is to the global majority. So if you do it the Chinese way, which is always very measured, the leaderships in BRICS, the different leaderships, they believe that they will be able to attract even more nations from the global south, especially Africa. And Putin named the two, let's say, the two biggest pools of new BRICS members. Where will they come from? He actually said, he spelled that out yesterday, Africa and Southeast Asia, which is true. There are at least 7 or 8 African nations who already applied for BRICS. And at least half of ASEAN, the ASEAN 10, at least 5 already applied or want to be part of it as well. So these are the two new drivers. Interesting. And when you add to it the economic corridors, the connectivity corridors across Eurasia, but also what China has been building in Africa for the past 2 decades. They are building connectivity corridors across China. And very, very important, the role of the new Sahel coalition, the role of this union in the Sahel, which we could not even imagine a year ago. And now we can have all over the Sahel from the west to the east, would be almost like cutting Africa in half, because the Maghreb over there, it's another story, including everything from devastated nations like Libya to Western vassals like Morocco. But the most important thing is the Sahel. And they have a lot of natural resources as well. And they are forging a political partnership. This is immense. And if you follow the map and you go all the way to the east, where do you head to? Ethiopia, which is already a BRICS member. So obviously the Chinese and the Russians, we can imagine that a year ago they were already thinking about that. Okay, let's reorganize the map of Africa. What do the Americans have to offer Africa? Nothing apart from AFRICOM.
What did the French have to offer, Pepe? We saw
I'm
these.
sorry?
What did the French have to offer? The western part of the Sahara.
They are being exactly, Joe. And they are being expelled little by little from everywhere in West Africa. Because these new leaderships, they finally woke up to some absolutely glaring, obvious facts, like they don't have control over their monetary policy. It's controlled by the Bank of France. This is completely absurd. And it was like a fact of nature for decades.
It's called colonialism. It never ended. But anyway, an aspect of it.
Even after Bandung in 1955, you're right. It never ended in the end.
Never ended. But it is ending now, isn't it? This is part of the earthquake that's going on geopolitically. What happened in the Sahel? It's in those countries, Gabon and Cote d'Ivoire, etc. Extraordinary. And those are ripe for becoming BRICS members, is what you were saying. Putin was
all of them, Joe. All of them. Absolutely. And when they
scare the shit out of Washington and Paris, doesn't it? It has to scare the hell out of them.
Oh, yes, Joe, because when they look around, where is the only region where they still have some clout? South America. And that's an enormous problem for BRICS member Brazil. Enormous. Well, we could have a gigantic conversation about this. It's very sensitive.
Let me ask you about that, because there's been very little in the American press about this summit. They don't get how important. But there was an interesting piece in Foreign Affairs. It was quite detailed, and it seemed to understand at least some of the process that's going on here. And it highlighted this supposed split in BRICS between the anti-West bloc, China and Russia, and those who were non-aligned, like India and Brazil. Are they playing that up? You said that Putin mentioned in his Friday press conference that he's not against the West. Was that to try to paper over or smooth out this split? Is there such a split? How important is that?
But they're trying to instrumentalize. This is the good old divide and rule tactic, of course. The only thing that they actually learned from the Roman Empire. And in the case of South America, the Americans had a huge tactical victory with Argentina falling on their lap, literally out of nowhere. And then you have Laura Richardson, the Southcom commander, going to Argentina and saying, oh, basically, we're going to install a NATO base here in the South Atlantic. And the Brazilians look at that and said, wow, South Atlantic is our sphere of influence. We cannot allow this to happen. So this is already an extra Brazil-US clash. And of course, the fact that Lula, his margin of maneuver is like this. He knows it. We all know that Lula is a fantastic articulator and negotiator, but his margin of maneuver, decreed by Jake Sullivan and others, is minimal. So he cannot do what he did in the late 2000s when he told Obama, I want to bypass the dollar. If he does this now, oh my God, he's back to jail. So he has to navigate all that. And to make it even more complicated, I was discussing this with a top Brazilian economist this past weekend. There is an anti-BRICS lobby in Brazil at the highest level. And Lula has to navigate that as well. So, for instance, Lavrov, Wang Yi, when they look at that, they said, yes, our partners, they have serious internal problems. And they need to navigate that. And at the same time, they need to be compatible with our agenda long-term, our BRICS agenda long-term, which, let's go straight to the point. The drivers are Russia and China. That's it. BRICS, it's a BRICS, it's a RC that drives BRICS, essentially. And of course, they try to drag India to the big picture as well, which explains what every BRICS summit, Putin calls Xi and Modi, they go to the same room, the three of them together, and then Putin tells both, okay, guys, sit down and, talk about it. There's nobody listening. It's only, I am the mediator and you talk directly to each other. And this helps. The relationship on a personal level also is extremely important in BRICS. It's not only foreign ministry articulation, that kind of stuff, So, but it's complicated. And Lavrov told us earlier this year, yes, the internal problems are enormous, but we trust that our partners will navigate their domestic problems. But when we come to our BRICS table, they see the big picture, which is something that we hope, and now it's hope. MBS in Saudi Arabia, we'll see. He's also under enormous American pressure. And that explains why he's not coming to Kazan. He's sending his foreign minister, which is a bit, level 2. But, okay, and obviously these past few days, lots of discussions. Why MBS is not coming? One of the reasons is that he fears a coup. And that's a pretty rational explanation.
Yeah.
So he doesn't want to travel. He prefers to concentrate on his internal dilemmas. And the foreign ministry, this foreign ministry is not bad. It's one of the best Saudi Arabia had in a long time. But they have to decide if they are in BRICS or not. And Peskov, Putin's spokesman, said explicitly, it will decide in Kazan next week.
Scott.
No, just a clarification. When I was speaking about BRICS and Ukraine, of course, there's not going to be a statement made about Ukraine. But imagine, if you would, if there was a statement about Ukraine and how BRICS would respond. Now, imagine them writing this statement. Now imagine them removing every reference to Ukraine. That's the statement they're going to be making, because the key aspect about Ukraine is opposing the American sanctions against Russia, not allowing the United States to get the world to sanction Russia. That's what I meant by Ukraine, that the BRICS is going to continue the processes of destroying the American sanction regime against Russia. And that's what I meant. So if you take what, all the economic interaction that's going to take place, and you package it. And then if you put on top a preamble that said that, Ukraine will not allow da. It's the same thing. It's the same policy. They're just not saying Ukraine, but
Right.
Ukraine is the unspoken reference there. I have a question for Pepe. My turn to ask a question now. If you remember in BRICS, I think it was Russia that had to hold off on taking over the chairmanship because of the special military operation. So it was passed to South Africa, and now Russia took it. It seems to me that Brazil's in a very, very tight spot. In fact, if
Yes.
I were BRICS, I would say that it'd be a very dangerous thing to have Brazil hosting the follow-on session because all the work that's gone into South Africa with expansion, Russia with the creating formal structures. If you turn it over to Brazil and then the United States is able to collapse the Lula regime and as such collapse that, would it not make sense for BRICS to say, hey, Brazil, why don't we pass over you this year? We're going to go on to India, let India run this thing, and then we'll come back to you next time. Is that something, have you even heard? Because when I look at BRICS and I look at all the strengths and the pillars that they're building, Brazil is the weak pillar, and you could collapse BRICS. You could do not fatal harm, but you could do significant harm. You could retard the growth of BRICS, the momentum of BRICS, by collapsing Brazil at the very moment when they're supposed to be hosting it. Am I just smoking dope, or is there anything there?
No, Scott, this is a very, very good point, in fact. It ties up with this gigantic problem of the very powerful anti-BRICS lobby in Brasilia and among people around the finance ministry, the Wall Street people in São Paulo. Don't forget that São Paulo, the business center of São Paulo, basically is an extension of Wall Street, essentially. And these people are all anti-BRICS. There's no question about that. So Lula has to navigate all this. And even his finance minister, Haddad, which, by the way, he's not a top-level economist. His PhD is in philosophy. So that complicates things a little bit. And he didn't come to the finance minister meeting last week here in Moscow. This was essential. He should have been here. He didn't. He sent a third-level diplomat. So that's even worse. And then, well, I was born in Brazil, so I know how they do things and how they are horrible at management. When the Brazilian presidency summit of BRICS, when it's going to be held next year? In June. And I was discussing with my interlocutor, are they crazy? In June, you follow half of the agenda for the whole year. Russia, it's in late October, because then they can do the recap of everything that was done during the year, over 200 meetings and all that. Yes, but they say that they have the COP meeting later that year in the Amazon, so they cannot do both at the same time. Oh my God. So then we start analyzing possible a solution would be the next G20 next year is going to be in South Africa in November next year, if I'm not mistaken. So consider that many BRICS leaders will be there for the G20. You could do a parallel recap BRICS session in South Africa. So then you can recap the whole year, like we're going to have next week in Kazan. So, this is a very small example of how they don't really know how to do things properly. And if you compound it with the power of the anti-BRICS lobby, it spells trouble. I agree with Scott. And depending on what anything that Lula does that falls off the strict delimitations that he received in person by Jake Sullivan before he got to power. Jake Sullivan went to Brasilia to read the Riot Act to Lula. This is what it was at the time. So his margin of maneuver is extremely slim. He has to be extremely careful. Unfortunately, I wish it was different, but and it pains me to say all this, but
Very good. Pepe, if you have to go, I have one last question for you.
yes, please, yes.
Like Scott, I'm very upset I'm not there next week in Kazan. I had originally planned to go, but I can't go. So I want to ask you a couple of questions about just how it works. I've covered 25 UN General Assemblies.
You
So
know how it works, Joe, right?
yeah, I want to ask you how similar it is. For example, in a UN General Assembly, there are many, many receptions. There's access to delegates. There's a plenary that's open to the public, to the press, committee meetings, interviews, and press conferences. Will you have all of that? Will you have access to delegates? Will there be a plenary that's open to the public? Are there going to be press conferences? What's the actual logistics of what? Are you going to be free to roam around there and meet with delegates? That kind of thing.
No, unfortunately not, Joe. Unfortunately not. Just to give an idea to you and to our audience, I only got my press pass yesterday,
Oh boy.
which
Yeah.
which is something completely nuts. They know who I am. I
Yeah.
write for Sputnik, which is Russian media, and they give you the press pass at the last minute with all those absolutely crazy rules to get a PCR test before you actually admit it to the venue. I talked to some insiders here. They said, forget it. Access to delegates will be ultra restricted because they're extremely paranoid with security, especially because Putin is going to be literally in the building.
Right.
So that complicates matters tremendously. So there are going to be extra layers of security. For instance, I usually go to the forums here, St. Petersburg and Vladivostok. It's okay, but when there is Putin at the plenary section, you see that the extra layer of security taking over everything. Plus, you need to take the second PCR test to get to the same auditorium. So this is going to be the same thing at the BRICS, with, of course, with the extra fact there are lots of heads of state as well with their own security detail. So it's going to be a nightmare. I'm not sure we're going to have our chance is parties at night, receptions at night, and we can grab a delegate or two and get some inside views. And of course, Sherpas will be there. So we can grab a Sherpa in the corridor after one of the sessions, that kind of stuff. But it's going to be very tough, Joe. Very, very tough.
How easy is it to get invited to those receptions? Because that was always prized in the UN too, getting invited to the German reception.
You need to know people from these foreign ministries.
Right.
In the case of Russia, if you have good relations with the Russian foreign ministry, they might invite you, but they are reticent because journalists, analysts, they're going to be leaks. We don't want leaks. And this is what they told me this week. They are absolutely terrified of leaks about important issues on the table.
Well, what about press conferences? Will there be joint heads of state together, a Putin press conference? Will you be able to go to that?
I assume, Joe, there will be a final press conference, probably with several heads of state. In fact, we all hope that. Can you imagine if we have on the same table Xi, Putin, Modi, and Lula? Wow.
Yeah.
That kind of stuff. But we're not betting on it. Maybe
You're
there
not
will
betting
be individual press conferences, certainly. The case of the Chinese is very complicated because everything, as you know, is extremely regimented in China. They might have, for instance, somebody from the foreign ministry giving a press conference, but not Xi himself, you see?
And sit down, at the UN General Assembly, they arrange sit-down exclusive interviews with heads of state. I was able to interview Shevardnadze when he was president of Georgia.
Exactly. Yes.
Will they be doing things like that? No.
We don't think so. For instance, there's something very interesting. RT, they're going to have a super studio in front of the Kazan Kremlin. And they told me, look, you can come anytime you want and all that. I assume because RT is this, basically it's a global company and it's watched all over the world, they will manage to bring VIPs for exclusive interviews at this Kremlin, by the Kremlin studio. So this will be a an excellent observation point, in fact, to snatch somebody for 30 seconds.
Interesting. Very interesting. Well, thank you, Pepe. Scott, do you have a few last words to share with us?
No, I mean, this is, first of all, thank you very much for putting this on. Pepe, thanks for joining from Moscow.
Thank you, Scott. Thank you, Joe.
And just understand that you will have to buy me beer for the rest of your life because you have to pay me back for stealing all the thunder of BRICS. I mean, my feelings are hurt. I'll never forgive you. But
No, I hope I can invite you for the best Belgian brasserie in Moscow next time you come.
I'm ready.
With the best beers on the planet.
And Joe, I would just ask maybe if you could consider doing this once BRICS is concluded and we can have a wrap-up session.
I was actually going to ask you, both of you, if you'll do that. And if Scott, if you tell me you only have 10 minutes, then I'll let you go first next time. So
no. I always I learned
and
so
you can
much.
steal his thunder. You can steal Pepe's thunder. Yeah.
No, this is.
I would like
Pepe's
that.
gonna be there.
Pepe, can you agree to that, to do a session together when it's over to recap?
Yes, of course. Already agreed. Of course. Of
Excellent.
course.
Excellent. Looking forward to that. And you'll be
Thank you,
reporting.
guys.
You'll be reporting for the Cradle during the summit.
Yes, I'll certainly be. Yes, and I'll try to do some 1 minutes for some media. Certainly for Sputnik. Monday, I'll have a pre-BRICS column. Basically discuss everything that we discuss here. I'll put it in a column for Monday, and there's going to be another one afterwards. But in between, I would like to maybe go on X.
Yeah,
3 or 4 times a day on X. 30
excellent.
seconds.
We'll be looking for that.
Twitter X. Yes. Yeah.
We're looking for that and using that in our reports. So thank you so much, Pepe. All the best.
Cheers. Bye.
Bye-bye.
Cheers. Bye.
Joined now by Mark Slebod out of Moscow. Mark has been a longtime geostrategic analyst. He really has his finger on what's going on in Eurasia, in Russia, in Europe, in the U.S., and he is here to talk to us about the BRICS summit beginning on Tuesday in Kazan. Mark, thank you for coming on CN Live.
Yeah, thanks for having me. It's always an honor and a pleasure to be on Consortium News.
And likewise to have you on. Mark, what are the 3, this is what I asked our previous guest, so I'm going to hit you with this. What are the 3 top stories you expect to come out of next week's summit?
Okay, so there is, I understand it, I have heard conflicting reports about whether there will be another round of BRICS expansion announced during the Kazan summit. So I think that whether expansion takes place and is announced at this summit, or whether it doesn't, that will definitely be one of the top stories to come out of the summit.
And who will those countries be if it does expand?
Well, according to the Belarusian foreign minister, he will be one. Belarus will be one. I see. This is, at least the sources about the expansion that I read were coming out of Belarus, and they seem to think that they were in pole position for those to be selected. I'm not so sure that is going to happen in this summit, and like I said, there have been conflicting reports on that. Some things that have come out of the Russian government seem to suggest that they were still working on integration of the expansion from last year. And that makes perfect sense to me. I have also heard that they were considering a tiered membership of BRICS, much like the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, which has a dialogue and observer status to that multilateral institution. And that might be a way to bring new members in and kind of bring them up to speed. So that is certainly another possibility that we could have announced.
Saudi Arabia is not a full member yet. Well, could that happen? Although I understand that Mohammed bin Salman is not coming. So that wouldn't seem to indicate that Saudi Arabia would move into full membership, right?
Saudi Arabia was invited at the last summit. And for the longest time, it was announced on Saudi TV that Saudi Arabia had officially joined BRICS, but it never actually happened. And there has been a lot of erroneous assumptions and reporting on this, and I'm as guilty as other people for the longest time, thinking that Saudi Arabia had joined, and evidently they have not. And I would suspect part of the reason is they're still testing the waters. I would not expect at the very earliest any final decision by Saudi Arabia, and they may drag this out for years, who knows? But certainly they won't make an announcement before the U.S. election.
Do you also suspect the heavy pressure Washington being applied on their necks not to join BRICS?
I'm sure there is, right? We know that Mohammed bin Salman and Joe Biden have terrible personal relations. I mean, Mohammed bin Salman hates Joe Biden, and we can assume, I think, that that works both ways. And that is not the only reason why Saudi Arabia has been, shall we say, looking for options or developing a multi-vector foreign policy. But that, I think, is a substantial part of it. Now, however, Mohammed bin Salman evidently, much like Israel, also had very good relations with Trump. So I think there is every possibility that Saudi Arabia may simply be waiting to see who wins the U.S. election. If it's Trump, then Saudi Arabia, may see how things go for a few years and may leave BRICS hanging. So I think that is a real possibility. But this Saudi Arabia playing this game now, along with the announcement from Argentina declining the invitation that they were given to join BRICS by this neoliberal freak, this nut job Malay, who has power in Argentina now, this openly pro-Western, pro-Israeli, pro-US neoliberal. We all know Zelensky's career started out as a comedian, right? He had no political experience, but I mean, at least as far as stand-up goes, Malay is a much better comedian. I think he's much more entertaining. I don't know how effective a leader for Argentina he will be, but regardless, that was a clear win, right, for the U.S. for U.S.-led Western hegemony, that they managed to snipe off a presumed, BRICS inductee, right, before they were even able to accept the membership. So chalk that one up in the win for the U.S. category. It was deeply humiliating for BRICS. And it points to, although the BRICS members claim, up and down, left and right, that BRICS is not a geopolitical bloc, and that it's not directed against anyone or anything. Well, the geopolitical bloc known as US-led Western global hegemony does regard that as a bloc and a bloc opposed to it. So regardless of what the BRICS members may think or say, the fact that the 1,000-pound gorilla in the room thinks differently kind of means that framing has very little value, because obviously they have to react, which is not to say that BRICS is an anti-US or anti-US hegemony alliance. I think there's a lot of people that have a very romanticized view of BRICS in that fashion. And I would love to think of BRICS that way myself. I think that there's a few countries within BRICS whose governments would like BRICS to occupy that position, but that is certainly not the consensus opinion within BRICS. Let's keep in mind that among the new inductees, the new members of BRICS, Egypt has for decades been one of the largest recipients of U.S. military aid. Both the United Arab Emirates and Saudi Arabia both also get their weapons from the United States, and both host U.S. troops. UAE hosts some 5,000 U.S. troops, right? And has for some quite considerable amount of time. And the Air Force base that they operate out of is an important part of U.S. Central Command's operations in the region. And, you know, even Brazil, Lula in his second presidency has been obviously playing much more cautiously and trying much harder not to get on the bad side geopolitically of the United States. And India has been, you know, by the current Modi government brought into Quad, which is an explicitly anti-Chinese U.S.-led geopolitical bloc for Asia, whose purpose is to contain, if not actually confront, China in what they now identify as the Indo-Pacific. You know, trying to turn India, the Indian people, into the same kind of proxy army against China that they have turned Ukraine into against Russia. So BRICS is not ostensibly, not technically, an anti-US alliance. Now, the fact that obviously the goal of BRICS as it exists, it is primarily an economic and trade organization. And the primary goal is to provide an alternative framework and trade between its members, and it's intended obviously to grow to that of the US-led Western hegemony. We're talking specifically first and foremost of the World Bank and the International Monetary Fund, where US and European control of these institutions, unproportional to, you know, today's current GDP and trade, has angered a lot of countries. And hence the BRICS primary success to this point is the BRICS New Development Bank, which in different ways can serve as an alternative to both the World Bank and the International Monetary Fund. The other big goal of BRICS at the moment is to create an alternative to the SWIFT international payment system, which we saw the US and the West weaponize against Russia immediately after Russia's intervention in the Ukrainian civil conflict. And the rest of the world, much of the rest of the world outside the West, was very unnerved by this. And they realized that their economies are probably not as well positioned as Russia's was to transition to its own internal payment system. And obviously that still creates lots of problems for international trade. So this made a lot of countries extremely uncomfortable. And that is another thing that will be announced in BRICS. I do not believe that a BRICS payment system, I've heard it referred to as BRICS Bridge, which the goal of which is a kind of digital integration, allowing the transaction of currencies between the respective countries' central banks. This isn't something that in any near amount of time is going to be like a BRICS credit card, right? It's not going to facilitate personal transactions. When it is developed, it will be primarily for large-scale trade at first between its members. But from everything I've heard, I think, one, that Putin wanted an agreement before the Kazan summit, and that was not reachable before the Kazan summit, as far as I have been able to tell. If they do announce that Bridge is coming online, I will be very surprised because there's no hint that has happened. My understanding is that some of the members of BRICS, particularly some of the new members, are not on board with everything that has been agreed to a certain degree up to this point, which is one of the reasons why, for everything that I've heard, that BRICS Bridge will not be finalized and announced during this summit, that it will take some more negotiations between the members.
And you're saying, sorry, Mark, Bridge is not for consumers, not at the consumer level?
No, not at first, right?
Not at
almost certainly, right? I mean, I don't believe that is actually a discussion. They're talking first and foremost about trade, facilitated through the transactions with the country's respective central banks, which will mean large-scale trade, right? Commodities, big trade deals, and the like. Eventually, it may be expanded to, conceive of that, but that's certainly not the first. And if some people are expecting a BRICS currency, that's not even being discussed. Right. I mean, maybe in some far future meetings, what a BRICS currency could someday conceivably look like. But there is not right now serious discussions or progress in terms of a BRICS currency. That simply isn't on the table yet. Right. That baby steps. Right. Let's work on a swift alternative before we start dreaming of things like a BRICS currency. I know it's already been dreamed of for quite a while, but multilateral organizations grow and progress as a rule very slowly, right? And BRICS, for how long it has been a real multilateral institution, has already accomplished more than comparative multilateral institutions. How long did it take the EU, the coal and the European coal and steel community that formed the nascent European Union, right, after World War II and Bretton Woods, to begin before we've reached the stage that the European Union is now, which is not to say that BRICS will ever look like the European Union. It's not the same type of multilateral beast at all, but simply that multilateral institutions take time. And because we have to assume that as far as we know, BRICS still operates on a consensus agreement level. That's one of the problems about expanding BRICS, right? You've already, even among the original 5 members, it's quite often obvious that India and China were not always going to agree on things, right? Much less, other members as well. But now with the BRICS expansion to include Ethiopia and Iran and the United Arab Emirates, consensus will be that much harder to reach with each successive round of expansion. And that it provides both benefits and problems. One, if you want to create an alternative global financial and economic architecture to that of the US-led West, primarily because of the US and West's abuse and weaponization of that architecture. That's why countries are looking for an alternative. That is, you want as many countries within that new system as possible, obviously. However, it becomes much, much harder to reach consensus on any issue. And if one country alone is enough to derail things, that creates a lot of problems. And I think we're in obviously not a completely parallel institution, but I believe that the Shanghai Cooperation Organization's expansion to include India and Pakistan both have led to a degree of paralysis of that institution in some ways. That when it was just Russia and China and the Central Asian states stuck between them, consensus was quite easily comparatively achieved. Now, it becomes more difficult. And I think BRICS will experience the same growing pains. Already, there is not easy consensus on things like BRICS Bridge as an alternative to SWIFT. And that will continue to be a problem as BRICS grows and grows more and more.
Do you think it's expanding too quickly then?
Yeah, I do think it's expanding too quickly. I think some of these things, like a BRICS bridge, should probably have been worked out before the current round of expansion, because it will be more difficult to reach consensus on things. If countries were buying into something that was already in place, that's completely different from trying to get their consensus going forward. And for some countries, it's obviously not as much an imperative as with others. For Russia, having an alternative to SWIFT to facilitate trade with India and China, right, in particular, is in the utmost priority right now, the utmost priority. And India has certainly benefited, right, from the purchase. India, out of nowhere, has become a major purchaser of Russian oil, whereas before it was quite marginalized. And this has been a blessing to India, right? India's own internal energy costs relative have gone down tremendously, right? That competitive advantage that once went to Europe has now gone to India. And like many countries, India often simply buys Russian oil, mixes it, refines it, and then sells it on to European countries that once bought Russian oil, now simply with a markup. Now, obviously, the US and Europe keep trying to throw up obstacles tepidly to that Russian-Indian energy trade, as well, of course, to Russian-Chinese energy trade. I have to say that they tend to go about this without a lot of conviction, because they realize the damage, the further damage it could do to not just the European economies, but to the global economy. And Germany is already facing deindustrialization over the loss of cheap, reliable, comparatively cheap and reliable Russian energy. Now they are still getting Russian energy. They're just getting it through middlemen, allowing them to claim that it's not really Russian energy, while even the Western media has admitted that, yeah, it's Russian energy. It's 9/10 Russian oil with 1/10 oil from somewhere else mixed in. It doesn't magically become non-Russian oil, but that is the game that everyone is playing. So obviously, India has a growing concern of wanting to be able to continue this trade with Russia, as the West tepidly keeps erecting obstacles, new sanctions to it. So there is some degree of other countries wanting an alternative to SWIFT as well, if only, to get access to Russian commodities and trade. But it still doesn't have the same prioritization as it does for Russia. And I do believe that Putin wanted to roll out that BRICS bridge at Kazan. And it does not appear at the moment, right, from what I've been able to ascertain, that it is going to happen. And that is obviously going to be, a quiet disappointment, whether it's voiced out loud or not.
As you say, it's mostly an economic organization, but politics will play an important role in the summit beginning Tuesday, particularly the Middle East. What do you expect to come out of the discussions on that?
I think that there will be a statement by BRICS about the conflict in the Middle East. I think it will definitely call for de-escalation. You will see some, I believe, mild remonstrations, in particular against Israel. However, they will obviously not be as strong as, individual statements from say Russia or China, have been towards Israel in this regard, because the UAE is an Arab country, a Gulf country, but they are also a military partner of the United States, right? The same thing with Egypt. So while there will be a statement, and I believe there will be a statement calling for de-escalation, like that really matters because let's face it, the BRICS calling for de-escalation doesn't matter at all.
But Iran is going to be welcomed as a new member this week of BRICS.
Yeah, they are already a new member, but yes, this
is their first summit. But I mean,
first presidential level summit. Yes.
So they'll be participating at a high level, and the president of Iran. Israel is poised to strike Iran, from what we're reading, and they've apparently agreed with the U.S. only to hit military targets, etc. And it will be before the U.S. election. Do you think it could come to spoil Iran and to disrupt? The Israelis like to make a big splash and screw up other people's parties. Could it come during these 3 days of the summit, Tuesday to Thursday?
Absolutely. It could come before then. Could come this weekend, which would, certainly spoil it to a certain degree even then. To have Israel attack a BRICS member with U.S. assistance, right? Because Israel cannot attack, without without active U.S. assistance, right? So essentially by Israel and the United States, whatever happens. And BRICS won't be able to do anything about it.
Which makes them look, which the Americans would like, weak.
Yeah, it does, right? If you tune into the Western media, how much coverage of BRICS do you see? Almost
Zero.
none. They don't even like to mention the word.
I have noticed that, and I'm looking forward to seeing what coverage there will be. There's been only a foreign affairs article, which actually got some of it. They seem to understand at least what's at stake here. So I don't know what's your understanding of the thinking in Washington, whether they know exactly what this threat is, this new world developing that's accelerated with the invasion, with the war in Ukraine, with the sanctions they put on Russia, a new world that they are being shut out of, that they are on the outside looking in, or they don't get it, or they're just trying to ignore it. What is the attitude, in your view, of the U.S.-led West towards BRICS, and particularly right now with the summit coming up?
Yeah, obviously, I think they see it as a potential threat down the road, right? Mm-hmm. As it stands right now, the new development bank is not much of a threat to the United States, right? Or to U.S. control of the world. And as things exist now, right, there is no threat other than mutual association outside of the control of U.S. hegemony happening. I believe that the administration probably understands the potential threat and believes that they can probably nullify it, right? And again, with the rather broad positions of BRICS now, with the new members, they may be right. What would it take just for Egypt to stand in the way of BRICS bridge?
You have to wonder why they let in an American ally like Egypt.
You do. You do have to wonder why.
Now,
I understand there's a prestige involved, right? Get as many countries in as fast as you can. I think it was a mistake, right? We'll find out in the course of time whether it was or not. They want as many countries inside the new system as possible. However, in my opinion, that probably would have been better as if the system was a little bit more well developed before you brought the new countries into it, because crafting that system will now be harder.
Now, the British Empire never faced any collection or an alliance of other countries opposed to it and trying to develop its own system apart from the British-run world. Can you think of any examples in history where an empire was faced with such an alliance like this?
Well, I mean, obviously, at some level, the Spanish Empire, they had their allies, and they tried to oppose the rise of the British Empire,
Right.
and Britain rolled right over them historically, right? But Spain was not completely alone in that regard, and they had rather substantial assets, globally behind them. They were just already behind the times. They were already antiquated, right, in their understanding of the importance of global trade. And we really can't historically ignore how much importance to the nascent British global economy that developed came on the back of the slave trade, which up until it didn't, the British Empire controlled. For all intents and purposes, so that was a big part of it. But historical analogies always ultimately fail. So I'm not one to place too much importance. I love history myself. I'm a history buff, but the modern world we face has so many differences from historical. I hesitate to use the word international relations, because it wasn't really international relations before, the 20th century. That is an entirely new construction, the international state system. So comparing what is happening now to what happened historically becomes problematic. And I try to stay outside of historical analogy as much as I think it can be too restricting.
Well, Spain was an already existing empire in decline, and Cromwell went after them, and then the rising American empire finished them off, basically.
Yes.
So that was not what I was saying. That this is an alliance that's growing up in reaction to an empire, the American empire. So you think in Washington they're aware of this threat? They're downplaying it clearly. In the media in the U.S. is downplaying it. But do you think this is every summit of BRICS seems to be the most important one that ever happened, and this is also the case? This is the most important one until next year's.
Yeah. Okay, so as much as the Western media tries to downplay BRICS' importance, at the same time, the media of the BRICS members, right, and shall we say supporters of a multipolar world, tend to overestimate each successive BRICS meeting, exactly as you have said. And while BRICS does definitely present the threat of an alternative, first as a potential alternative to U.S. led West's control of the international financial and trade infrastructure, and potentially the kernel of an entirely alternate world order, that is only potential at this point. There's very little reality to it. There isn't. Hopefully there will be. Hopefully there will be progress. That's why I'm so concerned about BRICS and expansion, because it becomes harder and harder to craft that the more voices that you have inside the system before the alternate system is created. And there is, the possibility that BRICS will become paralyzed by, again, just one member or a group of members. And if you don't think that the U.S. will be playing to manipulate BRICS members, all it takes is one BRICS member to have a U.S. influenced election like Argentina just had to paralyze BRICS. right? Imagine if Argentina had become a BRICS member, and then Malay won the election.
Yeah.
That would have been much worse.
Mm-hmm. Well,
So-
you've got somebody like Bolsonaro could come back in Brazil too.
Absolutely. I mean, let's hope that doesn't. I personally hope that that is the last thing I would wish on poor Brazil. But it's incredibly possible, right? In some ways, the more, of course, Western countries would say that Russia and China aren't democracies at all. I would disagree with that very strongly. Obviously, it's not something that looks like, I don't know, the Electoral College and campaign finance corruption that exists as quote unquote US democracy, which I have plenty of skepticisms about calling that actual democracy. And even former US presidents like Jimmy Carter have said it's just an oligarchy, but with very good PR. That threat of electoral politics radically changing the foreign policy course of BRICS members is a real threat in even countries like South Africa, Brazil, and India, much less the new BRICS members. So
what about Turkey trying to get in? What would that happen? What do you think of that?
I don't think anything of that. I don't take Erdogan's I take Erdogan's mutterings about BRICS about as seriously as I do Erdogan's threats about sending troops to Israel, which is to say I don't take it seriously at all.
Right, even though he hasn't cut off the oil going to Israel,
Yeah,
but he's
yeah.
talking about sending troops. He's like,
Erdogan is quite often a domestically focused, cunning beast. And you really, I mean, Erdogan does occasionally act when people don't expect him to, right? Libya is one clear example of him acting, and his support for Azerbaijan and the crushing of Armenia and Nagorno-Karabakh. So it's imperative not to underestimate Erdogan. I mean, look at Syria. That conflict is still frozen, and Turkey occupies all of northern Syria with roughly 100,000 jihadis under arms.
This is in Idlib.
And not just in Idlib, across the whole north of Syria, right?
Yeah.
That I don't know actually what it used to be called the New Syrian Army. I don't even know what it's called, whether it's still called that now. That's not even counting Idlib, right? That's Idlib is Al-Qaeda or Tahrir al-Sham. But the rest of northern Syria is still occupied by Turkey through Syrian proxies alongside Turkish forces, right? Where they have Turkish post offices, and Syrian children sing the Turkish anthem every morning, right, in their schools. So don't underestimate Erdogan by any, but it is possible to understand when he is bluffing, when he is blustering, and when he's not, right? And Turkey's primary trade partner continues to be the European Union, right? That is not going to change anytime soon. And he will continue to leverage Turkey's geopolitically important, pole position between the West and the East, between NATO and Russia, between the West and the Middle East. He does that extremely well, right? To, what he sees certainly as Turkey's benefit. But I think this is far more about getting leverage against the EU and the West. Not that it's going to help him get into the EU. I think he knows that's never going to happen at this point. But there's no way that BRICS should allow a NATO member in. I mean, maybe they have some idea, some fantasies that would wreck NATO. I think it is a lot more likely that it would wreck BRICS.
Yeah.
Than the other way around. So I don't think it's serious. If it is serious, it better be hell no.
Erdogan would never leave NATO if that were a condition to join BRICS, right?
Yeah, I know. No. He would never be allowed to. But no, I don't think he would ever do it. No.
And he's been invited, however, to Kazan to the.
Sure. Yeah. I mean, there's no problem in talking. There's no problem in flirting, right? Right. You know, putting a marriage ring on Erdogan is an entirely different kettle of beasts there. So
let's talk about Iran and Russia now. There's a lot of talk about the strategic partnership, when it will be signed, what it actually entails.
Yes.
Will that come up? Is that separate from the summit?
No. Well, that's a very good question. So we've been hearing for months, right, before Raisi was killed and before Pezeshkian became president.
I mean,
that new.
All right, then we'll talk about that afterward.
Yeah. Before that happened, there was already almost concrete that the new strengthened, deepened strategic partnership between Russia and Iran would be signed in October, right? And Kazan would seem to be a good place for that to happen, right? You know, you might say, well, maybe a bilateral summit, right, might be a more, suitable. That is possible too. There is every possibility, however, that what has happened in the Middle East, with Iran, Israel trying to start this war with Iran so desperately, that may have caused a delay in that strategic partnership being finalized. I do not think it means that it is something that is not going to happen. We don't know. I have not heard anything in the past 2 weeks about whether that will finally happen or not. Whether it will be done on the sidelines of Kazan. I have heard that it is possible, but I would not be at all surprised if it is delayed now and does not happen until after Kazan.
Wouldn't Iran want to sign this as quickly as possible to help deter Israel's attack?
Do you think that would deter Israel's attack?
Well, it depends on the deal. The deal's a weapons deal, right? There's no Russian involvement in the war. It's Iran.
We don't know, right? I very much doubt that the new strategic partnership between Russia and Iran will have a mutual defense clause like the one that was just signed between Russia and North Korea. On the other hand, if you had asked me immediately before whether Russia and North Korea would have signed a mutual defense relationship, I would have laughed at you. So Russia seems to have taken a radically new orientation. And while they certainly don't want to be dragged into a Middle East conflict, we can't write anything off the table at this point. But I think a big part of it will be Russia providing a lot of defense in terms of air defense and electronic warfare to Iran. I think that will become a major part of it. But perhaps the most important and immediately applicable thing that a lot of people underestimate is intelligence sharing and exactly how much access to Russian satellite data and GLONASS that Iran will get. I would imagine that's probably going to be a big part of the deal.
Yeah, Pepe Escobar earlier part of this program said he did not expect any kind of mutual defense, any kind of Article 5 type thing between.
I doubt it. I doubted. But again, I also doubted it. I don't know anyone who thought that Russia was about to sign a mutual defense pact with North Korea. If they were, kudos to them, because they saw something that no one else saw. But here we are.
You asked whether Israel will be deterred if there's this strategic partnership is signed.
No.
I think Israel, I'm an 8-minute drive from the Pentagon building right now where I am. And there happen to be some people in there wearing big boy pants. They're the only ones who seem to be sane inside the U.S. establishment, pulling back Blinken, for example, from allowing Keir Starmer, when he came to the White House, to use the storm shadows against, just fire deep into where you are in Russia. So I wonder if the Pentagon apparently has also been leaning hard on Israel not to strike oil infrastructure, nuclear, to try to avoid Russia getting involved here. So it's hard to believe, but I think one has to be appreciative of what the Pentagon is doing, the purveyor of the greatest violence in the history of the world, to stop the madness that could be coming out of Israel as well. But do they have that kind of leverage on Israel without saying we're cutting off the weapons and the money? What kind of leverage does the U.S. have?
Okay, so first and foremost, I think we recognize that there are two competing institutions right now within the U.S., at least two, right? You have the Department of Defense, the Pentagon, and you have the Department of War, which used to be known as the Department of State, right? And yes, the Department of Defense is serving as a rationality check and an obstacle, right, to Antony Blinken's Department of War, right? That's the sad state we're in, right? You know, where you know, what is supposed to be the top diplomat of the country, you know, and an institution that exists for the purpose of diplomacy is so neocon captured, you know, by Antony Blinken, that it is the most warmongering, war hawk institution in the U.S. government, and unrational. I mean, it must be said. The Pentagon, of course, can raise objections and point out rationality all the time. But ultimately, shots are called in the White House, right? And the White House is as beholden as the U.S. Congress is to IPAC, right? I mean, they've been called anti-Semites for it, but John Mearsheimer and Stephen Waltz wrote a book, The Lobby, right, about the power, the pernicious power that IPAC has over U.S. foreign policy against what should be U.S. national interests, where it's really not a question of America first or even hegemony first. It's Israel first, right? That is the foreign policy of the United States. It's unfathomable to me, right? And it, of course, is to a very big degree about money, right? About campaigns. But there is also a religious, ideological, political aspect to it. This cult of Israel that exists within the U.S. political and foreign policy elite. I can't understand it myself, but I recognize that it is not just money. That money may be the biggest part of it, but it would be a mistake to not understand the religious, ideological, this Christian Zionism, as they call it, this kind of apocalyptic longing within you know, certain American Christian groups that, you know, are so firmly behind Israel for their own twisted religious reasons. It's quite frightening. And ultimately, whatever the Pentagon may try to put on the brakes, it is the White House that calls the shots. And right now, Joe Biden is out to lunch, right? He's you know, on permanent senility vacation right now. And that is part of the problem, I believe, right now, is who is calling the shots in the White House on any given day. Is it Kamala Harris? Is it Antony Blinken? Is it Jake Sullivan? does Lloyd Austin show up and smack the kids around every once in a while? That is actually, I think, a very dangerous problem when the U.S. does not have a strong leader. That could actually make it a more dangerous beast in some ways than when it does have a strong, vile leader. That is something that Netanyahu is obviously fully cognizant of and very strongly exploiting right now, right? And perhaps one of the strongest voices in this U.S. Politburo right now that is running the country in place of Joe Biden is Blinken. And Blinken, he said it himself when right after October 7th of last year, when he arrived in Israel and said, "I'm here as a Jew, as a person of Jewish faith, and obviously a Zionist on top of that." And how many times do we need to hear Joe Biden, popping up whenever he is cognizant, right, and yelling, "I'm a Zionist." and I'm not afraid to say it. And back when Joe Biden was a fully mentally functional person, decades ago, saying that if Israel didn't exist, that the U.S. would have to invent it for the hegemonic role platform it plays for the U.S. in the Middle East. So, and what are we going to get out of the U.S. next U.S. election? Right? Trump will, if anything, feel the imperative to be even more supportive of Israel than Joe Biden has done. Not Joe Biden, or I should say the Biden administration has done. With the added icing to that is that Trump actually seems to get along with Netanyahu, right? Unlike Biden and Netanyahu. We have to remember, all the U.S. support for Israel in the last year has come despite the horrible personal relations between Biden and Netanyahu, right? And that has not substantially affected U.S. support for Israel. I mean, maybe the support would have been much more full-throated and military.
$100 million from Adelson's wife goes a long way to help Trump support Israel the way he does too, and giving away Golan Heights and moving the embassy and all that. But you're absolutely right; he will not be any better. You have to think that there's also a colonial settler mentality that exists, that is shared by the U.S. and Israel. But you're absolutely right, just to not dismiss the ideological and religious aspects of this. I think too many people do that. And the fact that there's overlapping imperial interests there. Israel's trying to rebuild a mythical ancient empire, all the way not only to the river, to the sea, but beyond the river, all the way to the Iranian border, maybe, if you believe Smotrich and what he said in a recent interview on a documentary.
And I think it's important to note that every U.S. president since the creation, the independent declaration of Israel, has known that and has facilitated it, right? Absolutely. Maybe Jimmy Carter put it into slow motion, right? Put it on, a slow track for a while, but that has the ethnic cleansing and colonization of Palestine has continued uninterrupted with the support of U.S. presidents, while they pretend that's not what they're doing for decades now. There is no denying that fact.
No, the Israelis have been open about, especially the early founders like Ben-Gurion in his diaries, what the Greater Israel Project was. Moshe Dayan saying, we stole the Gazans' land. Of course, they're going to try to kill us someday. So, I mean, it's obvious, but they have been able to fool a lot of people about that. Now, Pepe Escobar said earlier in this program that he thought that this move to accelerate the ethnic cleansing and the genocide that's been going on in various spurts over 80 years, partly, you may not agree with this, partly because of BRICS, that this new world that's arising, and the Israelis see that window to do this might be closing.
No.
You're smiling.
No, I think that is a perfect example of someone entirely overestimating BRICS and the effect that it is having on the world today and is likely to have in the near to medium future. I can't agree with. I mean, no, I can't agree with that at all. I think that Israel would. I don't believe that a new, deepened, strengthened Russian-Iranian strategic partnership would in any way deter an Israeli attack, right? It will simply be something that they have to take into account. However, I do believe that would have more of an effect than BRICS or any conceivable development of BRICS. Again, some people have a very fanciful, romantic idea of what BRICS is or what BRICS could become. And as much hope, I'm not a person who does hope as a rule. I don't believe in hope. All right, I'm a fatalist. I'm a realist. I'm a cynic. But most important, I'm a realist, right? And as much as I see the possibilities for BRICS, I think we need to have a tempered amount of hope for that potential that takes into account the problems of domestic politics and the changes in foreign policy and the continued ability of the US to reach out, influence governments, individual governments, and throw a wrench in the works by throwing a color revolution here or there.
Yeah, and instead of throwing a brick through the window here. One last question. The Pentagon wants to avoid confrontation with Russia in Ukraine and over Iran. Could that restrain the U.S. from participating in a war, even if, and that would mean, I think, Israel would not strike Iran if they don't think they have the U.S.'s back, in a big way anyway.
Yeah, okay, so first of all, it must be said that Russia and the United States are at war. Right. That has to be acknowledged, right?
Right?
There are U.S. boots on the ground, whether those are special forces and certain military experts firing the HIMARS and providing use of battlefield satellite, 24/7 real-time updated battle pads and whatever. The U.S. and Russia are at war. It is simply a question of how open and direct that war is. I believe that the Pentagon is putting the brakes on, or trying to put the brakes on, how much closer to direct and open conflict that becomes. Israel cannot conduct anything more than very limited air strikes and long range attacks on Iran without U.S. military support. I mean, if you simply look at the distances involved and the fact that refueling aircraft will have to be used for Israeli aircraft, or first of all, that says right there that any Israeli attack that is of any significant size, the U.S. will be obviously directly militarily involved. They may claim that, oh, well, we're not actually, our aircraft aren't actually dropping missiles. But if the fact that the refueling and the satellite data and everything else if the attack can't occur without the United States, then the United States is obviously involved, whatever they may try to claim otherwise. And this would be a very high degree of, higher in some respects actually than what we've seen, at least in the beginning of the conflict in Ukraine. So I think that there is a lot of horse trading going on right now between the Biden administration Politburo and Netanyahu. And they are probably offering him a lot of carrots because the stick doesn't work with Netanyahu to limit that on behalf of the Pentagon. I know there are some people who believe, who probably take the RAND project's reports on Persia a little too literally, right? And think that this is all some smoke and mirrors by the United States, that there's really no political disagreement and they're all slowly, purposefully moving to some type of war on and regime change of Iran. No, the Biden administration quite clearly wanted to ignore the Middle East to the extent that that's possible, right? Jake Sullivan, in the very week of October 7th, wrote an essay talking about how nice and quiet the Middle East has been that has allowed us to focus on other things. The Biden administration fantasized that they would be able to take Russia out quickly with sanctions that would destroy the Russian economy and result in regime change in Russia, right? And then pivot hard to China and ignore the Middle East. Well, as some famous British person once said, events, my dear boy, events. And plane, it completely went somewhere else. But the Pentagon has been splashing cold water on the rest of the Biden administration's power centers over the last year, saying, look, you have to understand that our military has, and our military industrial complex, by the way, have very real limitations, right? There's limit to what you can do with military power, and we have limits to our military power. And one of the big limitations right now is air defense interceptor missiles, right? The US does not have enough for Ukraine. They already didn't have enough for Saudi Arabia back when it was fighting the Houthis actively, right? The US had to cut deals with other Arab countries that had the Patriots, that they would send their Patriot interceptor missiles to Saudi Arabia, because Saudi Arabia, they were already running out of Patriot interceptors then. And the US makes a minuscule, a not sufficient amount of Patriots a year. I think it's like 500. And when you have to fire 2 of them at any potential target to have any, effective chance of taking it, the Patriot is actually not a very effective system, whatever the propagandists may try to tell you otherwise. But the US lacks the ability to provide air defense to Israel. And that is a very serious limitation on what Israel can or can't do. That we're facing a period that has never existed before, that Iran suddenly has very significant long-range, accurate, and effective long-range strike capability that they never had before. That was always the purview that Israel had on Iran. Now, Iran seems to have a greater at least independently, a greater long-range strike capability on Israel than the other way around. And Israel can't adequately defend themselves against Iran's strikes, right? We've seen the Iron Dome isn't designed to stop ballistic and hypersonic missiles. It's designed to stop the type of rockets, multiple launch rocket system rockets that Hezbollah and Hamas shoot into Israel, across the quote unquote borders there, right? I mean, that is what it's designed to. And Arrow and David Sling haven't proved that much more effective. This is why the US has sent one of their 7 THAAD systems. And even then, that is more symbolic because it can easily be overwhelmed. It's only got 48 interceptor missiles, right? For any given salvo, for any given attack. And if Iran can fire several hundred ballistic missiles again, that can not only overwhelm the THAAD system, it can take out the THAAD system. I think that one of the primary reasons the THAAD has been sent there, as cynic that I am, is simply that the 100 operators for it, 100 US troops operating it, are human tripwire deterrents against Iran. Meaning that if they hit the THAAD system, then Iran has killed American troops, right? That is, I think, a more significant deterrent than the THAAD system itself. And of course, I mean, if you don't think that the U.S. government would have such a callous attitude toward its military, being a U.S. military veteran, I can say you really need to wake up to the beast that you serve.
That's fascinating, Mark. Are you planning on going to Kazan for the summit?
No, and I'm not. I'm Moscow bound. I very much like Kazan. It is one of my favorite. It is the Eurasian capital of Russia, and as a good Eurasianist, I'm very much fond of that. But again, I think people place at the moment a unreasonable degree of it's not just overestimation, maybe it's hope on BRICS, then it is warranted. It's obviously a big event, but I think I'm comfortable in an armchair from Moscow observing it.
Very good, and I'm glad you sat in it today to give us all those insights. It's Mark Slebod coming from Moscow, and that's the end of our program today, and I want to thank everyone for joining us, and Kathy Vogan, our producer back in Sydney. And this is Joe Lauria for CN Live saying goodbye.